Over the last 2 months, we've seen plenty of outrage, killing after killing, and protest after protest, and for us, podcast after podcast. And if you haven't already, make sure to go and listen to our latest episode featuring Miss Hannon, briefly, Mr. Downer and Miss Bishop, with loads of great insight, as today we're going to continue the discussion about the civil unrest in our society. And today, for the first time ever, we have no guests. So it's a student-only special, and that includes Destiny and Bobby, both of whom have been to the protests. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
We're also today joined by Louise.
Hi.
Yasmin.
Hi, guys.
Karis.
Hello.
Anika.
Hi.
And Arian.
Hi.
But to kick us off here in this third episode of our podcast, we'll focus on Destiny and Bobby because both of them attended these protests when they were first getting underway in Wolverhampton. So I don't know, Bobby, do you want to start here? What was the main takeaway from that experience?
It was a few weeks ago, so I went on the 7th of June to the protest in West Park, and it really had this sense of togetherness and unity, and was a great stride against racism. There were some very powerful speeches there, and I think it was a brilliant display of how there are people in society, irrespective of how the media portray society to be divided, there are people prepared to take a stance against it and take a stance against the racism that plagues our society.
Destiny?
Following on from what Bobby said, I really enjoyed it, and there were so many different types of people. There are different kind of races, ages, genders, and it's just really nice to see everyone comes as a community to support each other.
I think that's one of the main takeaways, isn't it? There was a multiracial sort of demographic of people there. Would you guys agree?
Absolutely. It wasn't just like sort of young black people, for example. There were people of every race, every gender, every sort of orientation. It was a brilliant display of people, and it was great to see.
Okay, so I'll open this up to everybody else. How important do you think this is, and do you think it will have the desired long-term impact? I don't mind. Who wants to go first?
I think this whole situation with the protests, the petitions, people donating to different charities to help make change, it's one of the most important things that I know I've personally lived through. And I think it just shows that despite the lack of change that's happened in the past when things like this have happened, now we're really just, people are frustrated, they're tired of it, and they're not going to accept it anymore, and they're just striving for a change. And I think because of how it's carried on and how it hasn't really lost any momentum, I think it will result in some sort of long-term change, and you can see that it has actually caused change to happen, especially in the US with I think it's been known as law that's been passed, and hopefully that'll just carry on into the future.
Yeah. Bobby?
Sorry?
Do you have something to say?
I would say that right now in America it's an incredibly divisive time. For example, just today, Donald Trump tweeted a video in which protesters were exclaiming about white power and white privilege. Particularly in America and in this country too, there is this sort of shift to nationalism and a more right-wing shift in general by society. So I think that, but I think at the same time there is more awareness and more conscientiousness about racism and a sort of wokeness to racial injustice in both societies. It is an incredibly divisive time, and we'll have to see how it turns out.
Yeah, I saw that White Power video also, and just to indicate the change, yesterday Mississippi announced that the Confederate flag would no longer be a part of their state flag. And obviously that's a symbol of slavery, and the sort of the original oppression of black people that has us where we are today. And of course, the remnants of that are still very much present, aren't they?
Absolutely. Because if you look at anywhere, particularly in the American South, there's still so many people who have Confederate flags. There's still so many people who pay homage to slave owners and people who have done very heinous things throughout American history and society. There's still a very large portion of people today who idolize these figures.
Yeah, and of course talking about slaves and statues, and this was one of the flashpoints in the protests. How like it was that now, a month ago almost, and that was the Colston statue in Bristol being taken down. I mean, what do you guys think about, you know, the taking down of statues?
To be honest, I think it's a step in the right direction of kind of removing these people who have had this involvement in slavery and, you know, racism, and removing them from pedestals of like admiration and portraying them as pillars in society, and instead maybe taking the statues down and putting them in places like museums with correct factual histories of that person, to show people how you know, how they really were, instead of idolizing them.
Yeah, and let's just clarify to anyone who thinks that this is erasing history. History is not sort of immortalized in a statue. So that's just one of the most nonsensical things I've ever heard. Would you guys agree?
I mean, absolutely. If you take the Nazis, for example, Germany was very stern about not having any Nazi statues or things that can be idolized by neo-Nazis and Nazi supporters, because ultimately it just creates a space for very right-winged, very nationalistic protesters to gather, and that's something that we don't want. And it's not erasing history, but it's condemning the terrible parts of our history, which allows us to progress. I mean, if you are a black person in Bristol and you had to walk past that statue on a regular basis, I can imagine that knowing that this slave owner was idolized, and you know, a statue is a way of paying respect to someone. It's not a way of cementing history. So I think that a museum is far more appropriate.
Yeah, and we should just be clear, when we talk about the right, we're talking about the far right, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Just to be clear when we say that. Don't want to get into trouble here.
And I think, to follow on from what Bobby said, he's right. We're not erasing history, and in a way, history's already been erased in the, when we're talking about people who maybe look at those statues and say that they are heroes or pioneers, instead of acknowledging their parts in slavery, because people, it's very buried under the surface, and people don't really recognize the significance of you know, the significance and kind of the negative feelings that that statue could cause in, you know, black people who, you know, that's basically a symbol of the oppressors of their ancestors.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it? Aaron, I think you've got something to say.
I think when we're talking about things like statues and idolizing people, I think it's just a natural instinct if you were walking on the street and you see a statue to think that, oh, this must have been a great person for them to have put a statue there. So I think like from a more like people perspective, if you were to see a statue somewhere, maybe it is better if there was more information provided, like Louise said, in museums and things, but statues are everywhere, and regardless of whether they were good or bad, I think there should be some sort of information regarding who they are with the statue itself.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just a piece of metal, really. And of course, we did see across the country these anti-racism protesters who were there to protect the statues. I mean, what do we say about that? More offended by graffiti on a statue than a knee on a neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
I don't know. I think when it gets to the point where you are afraid or angered by a statue being taken down and you're threatened by it, and you are unwilling to accept the fact that this person has caused so much pain and anguish in people's lives, because fair enough, a lot of people before these protests didn't actually know the true historical significance of those statues, and a lot of them, when they learnt about it, you know, they allowed themselves to accept that that person did those things. But if you recognise the historical significance and you are still willing to defend the statue of a person who was so involved in the slave trade, then it's just it shows something about your character that's not necessarily a desirable trait to have.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of our last episode, I talked about sort of other opinions that we've heard, and so if I just sort of like say some things and then you guys can respond. So first of all, a lot of people, I don't know why, for some reason, the words Black Lives Matter offends them. And they just can't bring themselves to say those words. You ask them, they say all lives matter. Now, of course, all lives do matter. They cannot until Black Lives Matter. So, I mean, if someone says in response to Black Lives Matter, well, white lives matter, I mean, how do we react to that?
Well, I think the basis of it is basic. You think of it and it's like, if all lives matter, shouldn't Black Lives matter as well? Because before all lives can matter, the lives that are in danger right now need to kind of take priority before all lives can matter.
Yeah, and I think what people need to realise is the Black Lives Matter movement isn't about diminishing the value of other people's lives. It's about bringing value back and reminding people who clearly don't value the lives of Black people that, you know, we are living people, we feel things, and it doesn't matter, you know, whether or not you know, they think these people have, you know, done something wrong, or if they've committed a crime, because even though they may have committed a crime, it doesn't mean they, you know, they deserve to die, because there are plenty of people out there who have you know, done things such as, you know, it's not major crimes, it's minor crimes, such as there was a man who committed theft, and it was $9 worth of theft, and he spent something like 38 years in jail. And then there are people who, for example, George Floyd, it was a suspected
He forged a check.
Sorry?
He forged a check, I think.
Yeah, and then he forged a check and he died for it, and that's just not fair. And if people are saying white lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, and they're fine with the idea that, you know, that they can say white lives matter and it's okay, then the problem isn't with the lack of, you know, equality or whatever they believe in Black Lives Matter. The problem is with the word black, and it's just unfair.
I think when going from Louise's point, I think the main part of this whole Black Lives Matter is trying to push that idea of equality. It's talking about not just having different people prioritized on the way that they look. It's about making everyone in the world equal, because at the end of the day, we're all humans, and I think that people don't understand that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to make the struggles that get rid of them, and they're trying to say, well, black people are also just as equal as every other single person on this planet. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions, because people think that we're trying to put someone on a higher stool than another person, but it's trying to say that we're all on the same level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And like, just to add to that, the people that are saying all lives matter, it's like they're just sheltered and really selfish, because it's not all lives that are being oppressed. Not all people are being killed for the colour of their skin. And we can just like mention the famous metaphor of all houses and one's burning. Which one are you going to go to first? The one that's burning. I wanted to mention that.
Yeah, another good metaphor. So if you donate to a heart disease charity, you're not saying, you know, lungs don't matter, are you? And I've got my All Buildings Matter shirt ready for 9/11 also. You mentioned, I think his name was Willie Simmons in Alabama, who has spent nearly 40 years in jail for a $9 theft. That's one that I've signed and donated to on change.org. So if you are listening and you have an interest in that, you can absolutely just go and find that on change.org on the internet. Okay, so the next suggestion, people say, this is an American problem, it doesn't happen here. That's pretty ignorant, firstly. I mean, how would you respond if someone told you that?
Well, it may not be as explicit as someone being murdered in the street by a police officer, but if they actually took the time to acknowledge all of the microaggressions and all of the statistics that prove that black people are more likely to be stopped and searched without you know, any sort of explanation as to why, they're more likely to be held in jail based on the police's so-called suspicion that they have mental health problems that could cause them to harm others or themselves, and they're more likely to be exposed to brutal force by the police. And all of this just shows that the problem isn't only in the US, it's also in the UK. And even if the UK didn't have all of these problems, surely it's our duty as human beings to stand up and recognise when something is wrong, because if we just leave a country to its own resources and don't help or don't try and assist, then what kind of people does that make us?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
completely agree, Louise. Like, when people talk about the fact that it's only in the USA, it's just so ignorant that you could just think that, oh, there are no problems here at all and UK is completely perfect. So I feel like people need to realise that you're not just living in like a perfect world. There are going to be problems and we do need to address them. So
Yeah, Bobby?
Yeah, following on from that, I think whilst racism isn't as severe as it is in America, there are still statistics that show how much of a problem it is. For example, black people are 44 times more likely to be tainted under the Mental Health Act. They're 37 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. They're 3 times more likely to be arrested in this country, and they're twice as likely to die in police custody. And these are UK statistics. And even for things like weed possession, despite a higher proportion of white British people using weed, Black British people are 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched for weed. And these statistics really give an insight in not only the social discrimination, but the systematic racism that still lingers on in this country.
Yeah, the disproportionate sort of imprisonment of people from minority communities in our jails is actually now worse in America. I think I was reading, and those of us who've seen the documentary 13th, which I think I mentioned in the last edition, is a really good sort of look at that, and I think it's actually worse in this country. And then there's things like crack and cocaine, which are basically the same drug, the same substance, but crack, which was found predominantly in, you know, poor black neighborhoods, and cocaine, which is found primarily in upper class white neighborhoods, such that most of our cabinet has tried to do it, including our prime minister, though he couldn't stop sneezing afterwards. And crack, the punishment, the sentencing is actually 100 times worse, yet it's exactly the same, or virtually exactly the same drug. And that just sort of implicates actually there are systemic faults. And quickly, we talk about black people being more likely to be arrested. People will respond to that and say, well, they're more criminal, which is sort of a grossly racist thing to say.
It's absolutely ridiculous. Someone's skin pigment doesn't determine how likely they are to commit a crime. It doesn't determine their intelligence. It is literally their skin pigment and what part of the world their ancestors were originally from. It's ridiculous to draw any conclusions as a result of it.
Yeah, and if there wasn't such sort of financial inequalities, right, that the sort of the economic system has in place, because you know, let's be honest, if you're in a rough neighborhood, you know, income will be lower, you know, you're more likely to turn to crime just because you're not afforded the same educational opportunities, things like that, the same employment opportunities, not through your own sort of your lack of merit, just because that's the environment in which you were brought up in. So again, you sort of have this cause and consequence of sort of financial inequalities, and that leads to inequalities in the criminal justice system also. Okay, just another thing here. I think we all probably saw this in terms of what someone said. How come these protesters can stand shoulder to shoulder? They can stand up against racism, but my boyfriend can't come near me. Now, I can't quite believe that I have to sit here and explain to someone why, you know, literal daylight lynchings are of more importance than that sort of, what would we call it, romantic connection. But I mean, I think that was something that we probably all saw, and we probably all wanted to react to that. So I'll give you guys the chance to do that now.
I think my first response when I saw that was I actually had to do a double take, because I didn't quite register the first time when I'd read it. But I think what people need to understand is, yes, people are standing shoulder to shoulder for protests, but this is about human rights. This is about conflict that's been going on for years and years and years. This is about the systematic persecution and, you know, disadvantages that have been placed on the black community and the community of minorities. And to say that your own personal needs are greater than this whole movement is just so incredibly selfish and absolutely unbelievable.
I agree with Louise there. I think that mindset, it's blatant ignorance, because you are essentially saying, oh, the relationship I have with this person is, I see it as more important than the thousands of people that are being killed, that are being injured because of the color of their skin. And when people are trying to do something about it, you seem to have a problem with that. Like, yeah.
And coming off from what Louise and Karis just said, in order to change to happen, communities do have to come together in solidarity for like the basic human right that everyone deserves. And comparing that to meeting your boyfriend and doing some like meeting, that just sounds really silly to me, because how is a basic human right, the right to have life, the right to be yourself, and the right to not be judged compared to just going to the park with your boyfriend.
Okay, guys, another question here. What can be done? Because we've identified the problems, we've sort of responded to some of the problematic responses to the problem. Now we have to ask ourselves, what can we actually do? Now, Louise mentioned all those petitions, all those donations, all those sort of things, which is all great, and all those videos. But what actually can we do?
I think it's.
Sorry, Caris.
The stem of it is kind of, you need to educate yourselves, because once you educate yourself about the situation and what's going on, you can kind of grow from there and move on to actually doing something about it.
Yeah, and also, change doesn't come from complacency, and it comes from actually stepping up and taking action, and that may mean putting yourself in an uncomfortable situation. So when they say those things to, rip racism out of our society and try and highlight it, and that way we can get rid of it.
Yeah, and we mentioned those small things. I do think generally Highfields is a brilliant school in this aspect. I know diverse is one of the keywords, and I just remember reading in our sixth form bulletin, Mr. Pycroft, who we had on the show over a month ago now on our inaugural edition, and he said something on that bulletin. He said, if the world were more like Highfields, it would be a better place. And I think that's a sort of sentiment with which we can all agree. Now, Caris mentioned educating ourselves, because this is something that sometimes does get swept under the rug. What sort of documentaries, podcasts, articles, books, what sort of things can people be doing if they want to learn more about this and become more proactively anti-racist?
They should listen to the hate podcasts.
Yeah,
They should
and
be
also
doing that anyway.
yeah, and as you mentioned, Joe, they can watch The 13th on Netflix, and there's a documentary about the Central 5 boys, and it's called When They See Us. And then there's also Dear White People, which is a series educating people about white privilege. Yeah, and they're all on Netflix.
Yeah, that When They See Us, that's very difficult to watch. Such a horrible story. And I watched the documentary. I think it's just called Central Park 5. I think it's available on Channel 5 on demand or something like that. And again, just to literally 14-year-old lives ruined, and that sort of the media storm that came with that, just because it was a white woman and they were not. And of course there were very prominent people who said they should be executed for that. And for those who may be not familiar with the case, of course, a serial rapist who was in the area at the same time confessed to it, and DNA evidence freed them, but they still spent a lot of their youth in bad jails as a result of that.
And I think as well as watching documentaries and things, there are a whole multitude of books out there, and all you need to do is go online and Google them. But just kind of from the top of my head, I think there's How to Be an Anti-Racist, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and Just Mercy. And those are just 3 of many books that you can read to kind of educate yourself on how to be actively anti-racist.
Absolutely.
There's another book as well that's meant to be really good, and I think it's called Why I Can't Talk to White People About Racism, along those lines, that's the title. And apart from what my friends who have read it, apparently it's a really good book. It's really eye-opening, so I would definitely recommend reading that.
And do also educate yourself about black historical figures, the likes of Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King. I've read A Long Way to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. It's really quite impressive, and goes into the details about apartheid in South Africa. Just educate yourself on the history of racial injustice and how intolerance has always been something that's plagued society.
Yeah, another great documentary. I'm a couple of episodes in. I think it's called Rest in Power. It's about Trayvon Martin. I don't know if you guys have heard that name. Someone who was shot and killed by a man who was, I guess you'd call him like a vigilante, because he thought he looked suspicious. And I'm pretty sure on Facebook, and it's an account called something like Black Roots, and it's available on there. And there's just loads and loads and loads of documentaries and television programs about this sort of thing, scripted television programs as well. Again, just trying to make sure we educate ourselves, because sometimes we have that choice, don't we? You know, we could go and watch this program, you know, an action program about spies and all this sort of stuff, or instead we could watch a program that's educational. It's probably going to be tougher to watch, but at the same time, it's going to be more rewarding to ourselves and our community. So is there any more suggestions?
I was going to say and add on that I think it's also very important not to just talk about how Black people have been oppressed, also talk about and read and educate yourself on before slavery and how like Black people have been celebrated and the kings and the queens and all that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, is there any sort of final comments? Here's an interesting question. Do we think we can solve racism? Do you think this is something that, you know, when we leave this earth, you know, will not be such a problem? Or do you think there's always going to be that inherent prejudice to humanity?
I wish, you know, I could say, yes, I definitely think that we can end it. But there is only so much we can do through education and activism. And I think there are certain people who will always, you know, be stuck in their ways and will pass that on through generations. But that doesn't mean we should, you know, lose hope or stop trying to end it, because even in the past few weeks, we've made so much progress. And even though, you know, it's not likely that we will ever completely eradicate racism, there are steps we can take to, you know, make people realise that Black Lives Matter too, and that, you know, we need to be treating people equally and with, you know, equal respect, regardless of what they look like, where they're from, or, you know, who they love, or what they believe.
Yeah.
I think that progress should come through jurisdiction and law, and should be about changing the laws that we have of various countries around the world, rather than trying to win everyone's opinion, because ultimately human nature is to discriminate and view people as different, and tribalism and these sort of things have always existed and will always exist so long as there's differences between two people. So I think that what we need to do is, even our law, even the laws of the Western world and the Eastern world, and it needs to be changed. We need to lobby politicians and countries to fight against laws, and then the small minority of people that are racist will hopefully be silenced.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today. It's been a fun episode with no guests. Don't get us wrong, we love having guests on the show, but a good, honest discussion. And we should just stress, I mean, clearly there are strong opinions here, there are strong emotions, but if I'm being honest, I think the time for weak emotions and sort of being careful when we discuss this issue is over. I think we need to be strong, and I think we need to make sure this is not all right, and we're going to call that out. And you know, that's why there is the emotion in the discussion we had today and all those strong opinions. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe. And again, if you haven't already, it was a brilliant episode that we filmed, or that we recorded, with Miss Bishop, with Miss Downer, and with a brief cameo at the beginning from Miss Hannon. And of course, we were all there for that. Also, if you haven't already listened, I think there's over 250 views on our first episode, so make sure you go back check that out. Also, we've got Senora Darby, Mr. Pycroft talking about remote learning, life in lockdown, and what is next for all of us here at Highfield School. So again, thank you all for listening. For Louise, Yasmin, for Destiny, for Arian, for Bobby, for Karis, for Anika, and for Miss Banks, who puts this all together. We thank you all for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.